I was standing in a quiet bank lobby when my phone rang, and in less than 10 seconds, my life split clean in two. My son's voice was calm, almost efficient, as he told me he had sold my jewelry, sold the cabin, and would be gone by morning. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for a reply. In that silence, something inside me cracked, not loudly, but deep enough to change everything I believed about trust, family, and the fragile line between love and betrayal. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 67 years old, and for the past 6 years, I have lived alone on the Nevada side of Lake Tahoe, in the house my husband Arthur built with his own hands. He used to say the place would outlast both of us, and some mornings, when the light slides across the cedar floors and warms the beams above the windows, I believe he was right. The wood holds heat, memory, and a quiet steadiness that has made it easier to remain here after his absence became something permanent. Arthur designed the house so the front windows face the lake. At dawn, the water looks like brushed steel, and by mid-morning, it softens into blue glass. I sit at the small oak table with a mug of tea and watch the light travel across the surface. It is a habit now, not an indulgence. Routine keeps the day from unraveling. Before I retired, I worked as a chief accounting officer for a regional logistics firm in Reno. Numbers, order, and documentation shaped most of my adult life. Even now, every drawer in the house has a purpose, every folder a label, every statement reconciled and filed. Some people assume organization is about control. For me, it is about clarity. When Arthur died, paperwork arrived in waves. Because everything had its place, I did not drown. The quiet hours of the afternoon belonged to painting. I set up my easel near the east window where the light remained steady. I paint the shoreline, the trees, the slow shift of seasons on the mountain ridges. I am not trying to capture beauty so much as preserve stillness. When my brush moves across canvas, my breathing slows, and the world settles into something manageable. My son Michael used to visit on Sundays. He would bring store-bought pie and talk about business ventures with an energy that filled the house. In recent years, those visits have grown less frequent, replaced by short phone calls and hurried assurances that he is working things out. I know he has struggled financially. I have chosen to believe that struggle is temporary, the way winter storms are temporary, even when they feel endless while they rage. In the hallway closet rests a cedar chest that holds the few heirlooms I could not part with. A sapphire brooch that belonged to Arthur's mother, a pearl necklace given to me on our 25th anniversary, and a gold ring from my grandmother. They are insured, cataloged, and carefully wrapped, but their value has never been monetary to me. They hold the weight of touch, of ceremonies, of years lived alongside another person. North of here, tucked among tall pines, stands the family cabin Arthur built during the first decade of our marriage. We raised Michael in its summers, teaching him how to skip stones and split kindling. The place smells of sap and sun-warmed timber. I have kept it maintained, even when travel became harder, because it feels like a promise kept. Age has thinned my circle and quieted my days, but it has not diminished my resolve to remain self-reliant. I move more slowly now. I measure my steps on icy mornings. I recognize the subtle negotiations the body makes with time. Still, I have never imagined needing protection from my own child. At this stage of life, peace matters more than possession. I believed I understood the difference. I believed the foundation beneath me was settled and secure. I did not yet know how quickly certainty can fracture. If you're still watching and feel the calm before something changes, comment number 1 below so I know you're here. Now, let's step into the moment that shatters the silence. The bank in Incline Village was unusually quiet that morning. A light snow had fallen overnight, softening the roads and muting the usual weekday noise. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above a short line of customers, and the air carried the faint scent of paper and carpet cleaner. I stood at the counter with a deposit slip in hand, completing a routine task that required no thought. Order, numbers, and small errands have a way of keeping the day anchored. The young teller greeted me with the polite familiarity common in small communities. She recognized my face, even if she did not know my story. While she processed the deposit, my phone vibrated in the pocket of my wool coat. I glanced down and saw Michael's name on the screen. He had not called in weeks. I answered, expecting an update about work or a casual reassurance that he was managing. Instead, his voice arrived flat and efficient, as though he were reading from a prepared note. "We leave tomorrow. I sold your jewelry and the cabin. Goodbye." The line went silent before I could respond. There was no explanation, no hesitation, and no space left for questions. The words did not land like a blow. They settled instead like cold air filling a room. I lowered the phone and returned it to my pocket. The teller was still typing. A printer hummed and released a receipt. Nothing in the room suggested that anything had changed. "I would like to confirm another account," I said, my voice steady. "Under the name Whitmore." She paused, fingers hovering above the keyboard. "Whitmore?" "My maiden name," I clarified. She nodded and resumed typing. I watched the cursor blink on her screen, a small, steady pulse in an otherwise unmoving moment. When she handed me the receipt, I thanked her and stepped back into the muted daylight. Outside, the air was sharp enough to sting my lungs. Snow clung to the edges of the sidewalk, and the sky hung low and colorless above the lake. I stood beside my car for a moment before unlocking the door, aware of an unfamiliar stillness inside my chest. It was not shock. Shock scatters thought. What I felt was clarity gathering itself. Michael had crossed a boundary without warning, without permission, and without the weight of conscience. The efficiency of his words suggested he believed the matter settled. There would be no shouting in the bank parking lot, no frantic calls, no desperate pleading. Emotion would not restore what had been taken. As I drove along the shoreline road toward home, the landscape appeared unchanged, yet subtly altered. The pines stood motionless. The lake lay flat and gray beneath the winter sky. Familiar turns in the road seemed to arrive sooner than expected, as though distance had shortened. I understood that the quiet life I had so carefully constructed had shifted in a single phone call. Trust had not eroded gradually. It had been removed with precision. Clarity can arrive at the exact moment certainty fractures. By the time I turned into my driveway, I knew that whatever came next would require composure, documentation, and resolve. Panic would surrender control. Precision would restore it. I switched off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking of cooling metal beneath the hood. The house waited in stillness ahead of me. I drew a slow breath, stepped into the cold, and walked toward the door, aware that the peace I had protected for years had just been tested. If that phone call gave you chills, comment number 2 below to let me know you felt it too. Now let's see what the truth begins to reveal. When I stepped inside the house, Nothing appeared disturbed. The same pale winter light rested on the floorboards, and the faint scent of pine drifted from the wood stove Arthur had installed years ago. I hung my coat, placed my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, and stood for a moment in the stillness. Order remained intact. Only the meaning beneath it had shifted. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The small ritual steadied my breathing. While the water heated, I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and removed the file folder labeled Trust and Property. Arthur had believed in documentation the way some people believe in prayer. After his death, maintaining those records had become a form of continuity, a way of keeping his precision alive in the quiet rhythm of my days. I spread the documents across the kitchen table. The Whitmore Family Trust listed the lakeside cabin as protected property. Any transfer required my notarized signature and in-person verification. I traced the clause with my finger, reading it twice, not because I doubted the language, but because repetition steadied the mind. I had signed nothing. Next, I opened the insurance binder. Each piece of jewelry was cataloged with photographs, serial numbers, and updated appraisals completed less than a year ago. The sapphire brooch, the pearl necklace, my grandmother's ring. These items could not be sold through legitimate channels without leaving a record. The kettle whistled. I poured the water over chamomile and carried the cup to the table. Steam curled upward as I reached for my phone and dialed Robert Klein. Robert had handled our legal affairs for nearly 3 decades. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and unhurried. I explained only what was necessary. Michael claimed to have sold the cabin and jewelry. I needed to know what had been filed in the past 60 days. Deeds, transfers, power of attorney documents. Robert did not interrupt. He said he would begin immediately. After the call ended, the silence in the kitchen deepened. I sipped the tea and listened to the ticking clock above the doorway. Trust without verification, I thought, is a luxury reserved for people who have never been tested. 2 days later, Robert called back. I sat at the same table, pen poised over a legal pad, as he described what he had found. A deed transfer had been filed with a signature bearing my name. The notarization originated in Oregon rather than Nevada. The timestamp did not align with the county filing record. The irregularities suggested falsification. There was more. A bill of sale listed several jewelry items as irretrievable loss, a designation often used to bypass insurance tracking. Dealer records confirmed matching serial numbers for 2 pieces. The cabin, Robert said, was an escrow with a property development firm. Closing was imminent. I wrote down each detail: the notary's name, the dealer, the escrow company, the buyer. My handwriting remained steady. Robert asked if I wanted to file charges immediately. Not yet, I said. He paused, then accepted the answer without question. I wanted Michael to believe the transaction was proceeding. I wanted the illusion of success to hold long enough to reveal its full shape. When the call ended, I remained at the table, reviewing the notes. This was no impulsive act born of desperation. It was structured, deliberate, and layered with deception. The line between protecting my child and enabling him had finally become visible. I closed the folder and rested my hand on its cover, aware that what lay ahead would require more than patience. It would require clarity, documentation, and the willingness to let consequences arrive. If you sense this is no longer just a family issue, comment number 3 below, so I know you're following closely. Now, watch how quiet preparation changes everything. I woke before sunrise, long before the first band of light touched the lake. The house was cold in that particular way winter mornings can be, when even the walls seem to hold their breath. I lay still for a moment, listening to the faint creak of wood adjusting to temperature, and felt a clarity settle into place. Panic would only cloud judgment. timing and preparation would determine what happened next. By the time the coffee finished brewing, the sky had turned a pale, colorless gray. I dressed in layers and gathered my folder, then drove south along the highway toward an older bank branch I had not visited in years. It sat just beyond the edge of town, beside a feed store and a shuttered diner whose sign had not been lit in a decade. Nothing about the building invited attention, which was precisely why Arthur and I had chosen it. Inside, the air carried the cool metallic scent common to vaults in old currency. The manager had changed, but procedure had not. I signed the register, presented identification, and was escorted to the safe deposit room. The heavy door closed behind me with a softened echo. My box slid open with a familiar resistance. Inside lay the original Whitmore Family Trust, its edges softened by time, along with a folder of legal certifications and Arthur's handwritten annotations in the margins. His notes were written in deliberate block letters, reminders to verify, to protect, to never assume good intentions would replace proper documentation. I paused over one line he had underlined twice. Protection is an act of care, not distrust. Beneath the trust papers rested documents for Whitmore Timber, LLC, a dormant holding company created decades earlier to manage land parcels Arthur refused to sell. The company remained active, filed under my maiden name in a neighboring county. Michael had never asked about it. He had never known it existed. I removed the trust documents I might need and one checkbook linked to the company. The paper felt heavier than its weight suggested, as though it carried not money, but contingency. At the front counter, I requested to open an account under the name Evelyn Whitmore. The clerk asked routine questions and printed the necessary forms. I transferred a reserve fund sufficient to ensure liquidity and wired a legal retainer to Robert Klein's office, authorizing him to act without delay if circumstances required filings or holds. The transactions were procedural, almost dull in their simplicity. Yet with each signature, the path ahead became more defined. This was not revenge. It was arithmetic, a balancing of columns that had slipped out of alignment. When I stepped back outside, the cold air struck my face with a clean sharpness. I sat in the car for a moment before turning the key, aware of a strange steadiness settling in my chest. I did not feel victorious. I felt prepared. On the drive home, I passed my street without turning. The decision arrived without deliberation. Instead, I continued toward the narrow road that wound through stands of pine toward the family cabin. Dusk had begun its slow descent, turning the snow along the roadside a muted blue. The mountains darkened against the sky, and the lake reflected the fading light like brushed steel. I wanted to see the cabin before the machinery of legal action began to move. Not to defend it, but to remember what it was I was reclaiming. As the road curved upward and the trees thickened around me, I understood that preparation creates its own momentum. Each step forward narrowed the possibility of retreat. Whatever remained between Michael and me would be altered by what came next. The tires crunched over packed snow as I turned onto the final stretch of gravel. Evening gathered in the trees, and I drove on, aware that I had crossed from hesitation into action. If you feel the tension building beneath the surface, comment number 4 below to stay with me. Now we're about to witness the moment everything turns. By the time I turned onto the narrow road leading to the cabin, dusk had settled into that muted blue hour when shapes soften and distances blur. Snow pressed flat beneath my tires, and the surrounding pines stood motionless, their dark outlines closing in as the road curved deeper into the trees. I expected darkness and stillness. Instead, a faint glow flickered between the trunks ahead. I slowed before the clearing came into view. Two unfamiliar vehicles were parked beside the cabin, their silhouettes outlined in porch light. Music drifted through the cold air, its rhythm softened by distance, yet unmistakably celebratory. The sound did not belong to Winter Woods. I pulled to the side of the road and turned off the engine. Silence rushed back in around me, broken only by the distant pulse of bass and the faint clink of glass. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, layered now with something sharper, the sweet, fermented scent of wine carried on the cold. I stepped from the car and moved quietly along the edge of the trees. Snow compressed beneath my boots with a soft, deliberate crunch. Through the branches, I could see light spilling from the kitchen windows and movement across the back deck. Michael stood near a stack of cardboard boxes, a wineglass balanced loosely in his hand. Melissa leaned against the railing, her coat unbuttoned despite the cold, her posture relaxed in a way I had not seen in years. Two other couples lounged in folding chairs, their laughter drifting into the darkness. Boxes were stacked along the wall, sealed and labeled in thick marker. Some bore the names of moving companies. Others were marked simply with arrows and the word fragile. A portable speaker rested on the table beside an open bottle of red wine and a scatter of plastic cups. I remained in the shadows, unseen. Melissa lifted her glass toward the boxes. She spoke with bright certainty, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The money would arrive within 48 hours, she said. They would be gone before the week ended. Michael touched his glass to hers. He said I would not notice what was missing. One of their friends asked whether I might discover the sale. Melissa laughed, dismissing the idea with an easy wave of her hand. She suggested I barely checked my mail, let alone financial records. The others joined her laughter, the sound quick and careless, rising above the trees before dissolving into the cold. The words did not strike like blows. They settled slowly, each one finding its place. I watched my son raise his glass again, watched the ease in his shoulders, the relief of someone who believes a burden has been lifted. For a moment, I saw him as he had been at 10 years old, standing on this same deck with wet hair and a towel around his shoulders, asking if we could stay one more day before school began. Memory pressed against the present, then receded. Their certainty hung in the air like breath in winter. They believed the outcome assured, the future already secured. In that confidence lay the narrow seam of vulnerability they could not see. I did not step forward. I did not call his name. Confrontation would only grant them time to adapt. Instead, I turned back toward the trees and walked the path I had come, each step measured and silent. When I reached the car, I sat without starting the engine. Through the windshield, the cabin lights glowed faintly between the branches. Laughter drifted across the snow. I took out my phone and called Robert Klein. When he answered, I said only that the escrow freeze needed to be filed tonight. He did not ask why. After the call ended, I remained in the dark, listening to the celebration continue in the distance. Humiliation had sharpened into something colder and more precise. Dignity, I understood, sometimes requires silence before response. I started the engine and turned the car toward the road. Behind me, the music continued, glasses clinked, and voices lifted in confidence. By morning, the certainty they toasted would begin to collapse. I returned home long after the last light had drained from the sky. The house received me in stillness, the familiar creak of the floorboards and the faint warmth from the wood stove forming a quiet barrier between what I had witnessed and the calm I intended to keep. I set my keys in their usual place and went to the kitchen sink, letting cold water run over my hands until the chill traveled up my wrists. The sensation steadied me, drawing my attention back into my body. I moved through the rooms, switching off lamps I had left burning earlier, containing the space as though drawing curtains around a fragile interior. When I finally lay down, sleep did not arrive, yet I rested without agitation. Action, once begun, moves on its own momentum. There was nothing left for me to force. Sometime before dawn, Robert filed the escrow freeze. Notices citing suspected fraud and irregular documentation were transmitted to the buyer's attorney and the escrow firm. By morning, the closing process was halted under review protocol. Funds could not be released while the documentation remained in question. Contract language shifted liability, and the development firm withdrew rather than risk entanglement in a fraudulent transfer. I brewed coffee and stood at the window as the first gray light touched the lake. The water lay still beneath a low sky. I felt no triumph, only a quiet alignment, as if something that had tilted off balance was settling back into place. The pounding began just after 8. It struck the front door with a force that rattled the frame. I remained where I stood, hands wrapped around the mug, listening. Another blow followed, then the sharp report of a fist against wood. Michael's voice carried through the door, strained and jagged, though I could not make out the words. Footsteps scraped across the porch. The door shook again. I did not move. Anger expends itself quickly when it meets silence. After several minutes, the pounding stopped. I heard pacing, the hollow rhythm of boots crossing the boards, then a final thud against the railing. A car door slammed. Tires spun against packed snow before fading down the road. I waited 5 minutes more before setting the mug in the sink. Discipline, I had learned, is often a matter of waiting longer than emotion demands. I took my keys and drove toward the cabin. The road felt altered, not unfamiliar but reclaimed, as though I were returning to a place that had been held in suspension. Snow glittered beneath a pale sun, and the trees stood in unbroken lines along the narrow ascent. The cabin appeared unchanged. No vehicles, no footprints crossing the porch. The lock yielded to my key with its familiar click. Inside, the air was cold and still. Dust lay undisturbed along the windowsills. No boxes, no signs of staging, no evidence that anyone had entered to complete the fiction of sale. Michael had attempted to sell a memory without stepping inside it. I walked through the room slowly, my fingers brushing the worn edge of the table Arthur carved, the smooth banisters shaped by decades of hands. The house held the faint scent of aged wood and sun-warmed resin, preserved in the grain. In the study, I opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Arthur's original sketches lay where he had left them. Elevations, floor plans, notes written in precise block lettering. The cabin had begun as lines on paper, an idea carried into timber and stone. I rolled one sketch carefully and placed it in my bag. Outside, the air cut sharp and clean as I locked the door behind me. My phone vibrated with a brief message from Robert. The insurance investigator was ready to meet. Consequences were no longer approaching. They had arrived and begun their work. I drove down the mountain road with steady hands, aware that what remained ahead would unfold beyond anyone's control. If you can feel the ground shifting beneath everyone involved, comment number 6 below and stay with me as we move into Chapter 7. In the days that followed, consequences unfolded with a quiet authority that required no supervision from me. Systems moved, documents circulated, and decisions were made in offices far from the lake. I kept to my routines, rising early, making coffee, and opening the curtains to the pale winter light, while the machinery of accountability gathered momentum elsewhere. Robert called each afternoon, with updates delivered in his steady, measured tone. Financial institutions had frozen Michael's accounts, pending investigation. The fraudulent deed transfer triggered a property fraud review at the county level. the mortgage lender flagged the unauthorized loan attempt tied to the forged power of attorney. The development firm withdrew from the transaction and indicated it might pursue civil damages to recover losses. Insurance investigators opened a fraud inquiry regarding the jewelry claim. Dealer records confirmed the sale of insured items, including serial numbers that matched the policy file. Melissa's signature appeared on escrow submissions, linking her directly to the transaction. I wrote each detail in a legal pad, noting dates and names with the same discipline I had once applied to quarterly reports. The scale of the consequences extended beyond anything a family argument could contain. What had begun as betrayal now existed in the realm of law. 2 days later, the sheriff's office requested documentation. I provided copies of the trust, insurance appraisals, and a notarized affidavit. The deputy who collected the envelope spoke gently, as though aware that paperwork sometimes carries more weight than words. That afternoon, I scheduled a locksmith. The new locks clicked into place with a sound both final and protective. Robert delivered a formal notice revoking permission for occupancy, drafted in language precise enough to leave no room for interpretation. Michael returned once more. I saw his car through the front window. He approached the door and stopped when he saw the new lock. His shoulders remained still for a long moment, as if he were trying to interpret a language he had never expected to read. He did not knock. He stood there, then turned and walked back to the car. Boundaries, I understood, must sometimes be made visible before they can be respected. The house felt quieter after that, yet safer. I began packing my belongings with deliberate care. Each item was wrapped, labeled, and placed into boxes that accumulated along the hallway. I had arranged to move to a smaller residence near Truckee, close to a river trail and a modest community of artists. The decision was not retreat. It was a step toward autonomy. On moving day, the truck arrived at mid-morning. The crew worked efficiently, carrying my books, easel, and the cedar chest out to the driveway. Across the street, Michael and Melissa stood beside their car, watching with expressions I could not fully read. I kept my attention on the clipboard in my hands and did not meet their eyes. By late afternoon, the truck door closed, and I followed it down the road toward my new address. The house near the river was smaller, filled with soft, natural light that pooled across the maple floors. I placed the easel near the east window before unpacking anything else. Arthur's cabin sketch rested on the shelf beside it. I rinsed a brush and drew it once across the canvas. My hand remained steady. That evening, Robert called again. Insurance investigators and state authorities were now involved. The stakes had widened, yet I felt an unfamiliar grounding beneath my feet. Standing in the quiet room, I understood that while loss rearranges the landscape of a life, self-possession can still be reclaimed. Several days passed before the new house began to feel familiar. Morning light entered through the east windows in a pale wash, settling across the maple floors before climbing the opposite wall. Beyond the glass, the river moved in a slow winter current, its surface broken by dark stones and narrow seams of ice. The sound was steady and low, like breath drawn through sleep. I began walking the trail each morning, following the bend of the water until the cold worked its way through my gloves. The air carried the scent of wet earth and pine needles, sharper than the mountain air near the lake. When I returned, I arranged brushes, sorted paints, and adjusted the easel by inches until the light fell exactly where I wanted it. Order, even in a smaller space, restored proportion. Robert called twice with procedural updates. Investigators requested additional documentation. I provided copies already filed. Insurance auditors confirmed serial numbers and sales records. Evidence, I was reminded, does not respond to sentiment. It responds to accuracy. On the fourth afternoon, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once before answering. His voice carried strain rather than certainty. He spoke quickly, as though momentum alone could sustain the argument. He said he had been trying to fix things, to relieve pressure, to secure a future that had slipped beyond his reach. He insisted he intended to repay everything after the closing. I listened without interrupting. He said I never trusted him. The words arrived sharpened by exhaustion. When I spoke, I kept my voice even. Trust requires truth, I told him. Silence followed. I could hear his breathing, uneven, as if he were searching for ground beneath his feet. He said I had ruined his life by stopping the sale. I answered that his choices had created the consequences. The line remained open for several seconds. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us filled the quiet. Then he ended the call. I set the phone on the table and remained seated, my hands resting in my lap. The room felt larger in the absence of his voice. Outside, the river continued its slow passage around the stones, indifferent to the arrangements of human lives. Motherhood, I thought, is often mistaken for protection without boundary. Over the years, I had intervened quietly, smoothing difficulties, offering advice, solving small crises before they grew teeth. What I had believed was care may also have postponed accountability. The canvas on the easel waited in blank patience. I lifted a brush and mixed a darker tone than I usually used for winter water. The first stroke moved across the surface with deliberate weight. Another followed, broader, less cautious. The rhythm of movement steadied something that words could not. Near dusk, Robert left a message confirming that the investigation continued. The escrow firm and development company were pursuing financial recovery. Outcomes remained uncertain, but the process was moving forward. I stood by the window as the last light withdrew from the river. Responsibility, I understood, is not the same as guilt. One binds, the other clarifies. For the first time in many days, I felt no urge to intervene, explain, or repair. Whatever path Michael walked now would be his to navigate. Outside, the current pressed steadily onward, shaping its course around whatever resisted it. Clarity, I realized, often arrives only after truth has stripped away what cannot remain. If this moment made you reflect on truth and responsibility, comment number 8 below. Now let's move toward the final outcome of the story. Several weeks passed before the edges of winter began to soften. The river no longer wore a rigid skin of ice, and the current moved with a fuller sound, carrying fragments of thaw downstream. My days settled into a rhythm that required little adjustment. I painted in the mornings, walked into town when the light was brightest, and returned in the afternoons to the quiet order of the studio. The urgency that had once filled each hour had receded, replaced by a slower awareness of time. Robert continued to provide updates as the legal process advanced through its deliberate stages. Investigators requested clarifications, the insurance review remained open, and the development firm pursued financial recovery. Nothing resolved quickly. Paper moved from desk to desk, each signature carrying weight without spectacle. I listened, took notes, and then returned to the work before me. Distance had not erased the events, but it had altered their pressure. One afternoon, I found a plain envelope among the mail. There was no return address, only my name written in a familiar, uneven script. I recognized Michael's handwriting immediately. For a long moment, I held the envelope without opening it, aware that whatever waited inside might shift the careful balance I had built. I carried it to the chair beside the window, where winter light fell across the floor in a pale rectangle. The paper inside was thin and creased, as if folded more than once before being sealed. The letter was brief. The sentences wandered slightly, their structure uncertain, as though the act of writing required effort he had not practiced in years. He wrote that he had believed he was owed something, that pressure and fear had narrowed his thinking until he could no longer distinguish urgency from entitlement. He said he did not realize he was burning the last bridge between us. Melissa, he wrote, had left. She had taken her belongings and left the rest for him to sort through. The debts were his now. He understood that. He did not ask for money, assistance, or forgiveness. He wrote only that he wanted to become someone different, if that was still possible. I read the letter again, then folded it along its original crease. Memory arrived in fragments. Small lunches packed before school, late evenings helping him balance his first checking account, the summer he learned to split kindling behind the cabin. I thought about the ways support can quietly shift into expectation, and how expectation, left unexamined, can harden into grievance. What struck me most was what the letter did not ask for. There were no pleas, no negotiations, no attempt to bargain remorse for rescue. The absence felt deliberate. I sat for a long time before opening the desk drawer and removing a simple card embossed with my maiden name. The paper felt cool and smooth beneath my hand. I wrote a single line. I protected your name. Decide what it stands for. I sealed the envelope before hesitation could intervene and walked it to the mailbox at the corner. The metal lid closed with a hollow sound that echoed briefly in the cold air. Back inside, the studio felt unchanged. I rinsed my brush and returned to the canvas. The colors I mixed were deeper than before, the strokes broader, less cautious. Closure, I realized, does not require reconciliation. It requires clarity. Outside, the river moved steadily toward thaw, carrying away what winter could no longer hold. The past had not disappeared, but it had shifted its weight. It no longer pressed against the present. It settled instead into the quiet shape of history. By early spring, the light began to change. Mornings arrived with a softness that winter never permitted, and the air carried the faint scent of thawing earth from the riverbank. Snow retreated into shaded corners, leaving dark soil and the first stubborn shoots of grass pushing through. The shift was gradual, almost polite, yet unmistakable. I had settled into the rhythm of Truckee in a way that felt neither temporary nor resigned. The space I rented on the main road sat between a narrow bookstore and a bakery that opened before sunrise. The scent of warm bread drifted through the street each morning, mingling with the clean smell of pine carried down from the hills. I named the space Whitmore Art Studio. The name felt both familiar and newly claimed, a return to something that had waited quietly beneath decades of marriage and motherhood. The room itself was simple: wide windows, pale wooden floors, shelves lined with paint jars, and 3 easels arranged to face the light. I began teaching once a week. Retirees came on Fridays, their movements careful but their curiosity intact. Teenagers arrived on Wednesdays, some restless, some silent, all carrying more inside them than they could name. Some students talked while they worked. Others painted in complete silence. I allowed both. Quiet, I had learned, can be its own language. On the front wall, I framed Arthur's original sketch of the cabin, the lines still precise despite the years. Beneath it hangs a certified copy of the deed bearing my name. Between them, in a simple wooden frame, is a handwritten line: property can be replaced, dignity cannot. Visitors often pause before it. Some nod once and move on. Others stand longer, as if measuring the sentence against their own histories. Each morning before anyone arrives, I sit by the window and watch the light travel slowly across the floor. I no longer feel the tension of waiting for the next loss. The future does not feel like something approaching to take, but something opening to be lived. The cabin remains mine. It stands among the pines as it always has, no longer threatened, no longer defended, simply part of the landscape of my life. The timber land sale secured the stability Arthur once worried about, and the legal case continues at a distance that no longer defines my days. Sometimes, while wiping brushes at the sink, I wonder where Michael is and who he is becoming. I imagine him walking past the studio one afternoon, pausing at the name on the sign, perhaps recognizing something he once overlooked. Whether he enters or keeps walking is not a question I try to answer. Strength, I have learned, is not loud. It is sustained. At dusk, I rinse the brushes, return each jar to its shelf, and switch off the lights. The room settles into shadow, holding the day's quiet labor. I pause at the door before stepping outside into the cooling air. For the first time in many years, I recognize the woman I was before I ever had to defend myself. She has been here all along. In the end, what remains is not the loss itself, but the clarity that follows it. When trust fractures and certainty falls away, something quieter has the chance to emerge, a steadiness built not on possession, but on self-respect. Time has a way of revealing what truly belongs to us and what never did. Dignity cannot be transferred, stolen, or negotiated. It is protected through boundaries, restored through courage, and strengthened through truth. Life does not promise fairness, but it offers moments when we can choose who we become in response to hardship. In choosing calm over chaos and clarity over resentment, we reclaim our ground. Peace is not found in what we keep, but in what we refuse to surrender within ourselves. Thank you for spending this time here. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments and consider following and subscribing for more reflections and stories like this.